Good morning, everybody. Thank you so much for joining us for our webinar series. We are going to give it another moment or so as people file into our virtual auditorium, and then we will get this show on the road. All right, good morning. Welcome. Really pleased that you all decided to join us for this very important topic. My name is Pamela James. I am the Executive Director for Campus Human Resources, and you've joined us for our Working Well Remotely webinar series. Today's topic, managing staff through stressful situations. Given that we're coming up on almost a year of being in this pandemic environment, this is a very, very timely topic. So we're really excited that you decided to join us. This is our 5th topic of 8 in this particular webinar series. And hopefully some of you joined us last fall when we launched this series. We had 7 topics back then. And in fact, we'll put in the chat box right now where you can find those old recordings and PowerPoint materials from the last 7 topics. And then also all of this series is being recorded and is available to you or colleagues who missed it as well. So feel free to check out our website and refer back to these webinars at your convenience. So really excited you're here. This is a webinar format, a little bit different than a Zoom meeting. Our esteemed co-host and speaker and myself will be on camera, but we can't see you. So you will be able to ask questions through a Q&A box at the bottom versus a chat box. We might do a few messages out to you via chat, but to communicate with us, you do it through the Q&A box. So I'll monitor the Q&A and look forward to having everybody's participation. So with that, let's get to the main event where I get to introduce a couple of co-hosts who are cabinet members. We did this on purpose to give our employees visibility to senior leadership, as well as have some great speakers. So first, I'd love to introduce Dr. Willie Banks. Willie is our Vice Chancellor of Student Affairs. So Willie, could you take a couple minutes to just talk about what you do and why this particular topic is of interest to you?
Sure, Pamela, and thank you for the invitation to participate in today's call. And hello, everyone. I hope everyone is doing well and staying safe. My name is Willie Banks, and I serve as the Vice Chancellor for Student Affairs here at the University of California, Irvine. And I'm coming up to my 2-year anniversary in July of this year, so I'm excited about that. And in the world of student affairs, when people really ask the question, what is student affairs all about? We are here to really support the mission of the institution by really working with our students and on out of classroom experiences. So everything from residence life to student organizations to anything that you can think of in our health and wellness and counseling space, we really want to make sure that we are working with our students to develop the whole student and to really complement what they're learning in the academic classroom and really taking that information and really looking at it from a real world perspective once they're outside of the classroom. And so we are for our students. We are here for our students first and foremost. But I think the other piece that I'm really proud of is the work that we have and the people working within student affairs that really advance the mission of the institution. We have some great staff members that really care about our students and really push forward the experience of a UCI experience. So just kudos to all of our staff members from student affairs and from across campus that support the mission of the institution by working with our students. And this topic is really important because I do really think that everyone has been in a stressful situation for the past year. And I think COVID has really brought out all the stress. And I think that I hope that we learn some great things from Kenny, and really hoping that we all give ourselves some grace to really make it through the next few months, and if not another year. But let's see what happens. But I will be quiet right now and turn it back over to you, Pamela.
Great. Thank you so much, Willie. Well, now I have the pleasure of introducing my boss, Ramona Agrela. Ramona is our Associate Chancellor and the Chief HR Executive Officer. Ramona, could you tell us a little bit about your role and why you're interested in this topic?
Yes, thank you, Pamela. And I'm honored to be co-host this event with you. And I'm really honored that HRI was able to provide these webinar series to all of you. So thank you all for participating. This topic is important to me. I've been with UCI for over 20 years now, and have not seen anything like what we've seen this last year. It's really been eye-opening and just a tremendous event for all of us to try to figure out how to get through. And so this topic is very timely and very important, not only as an HR professional, but as a leader, as a supervisor. We want to make sure that we're providing our staff with the tools and resources they need to help them manage through this time. So I'm very excited to hear what Mr. Zuckerberg has to offer. And with that, I will actually introduce Kenny Zuckerberg. So it's my pleasure to introduce Kenny Zuckerberg. He's Vice President of Training for UCI's Employee Assistance Program. So we're ComPsych. So we're very excited that ComPsych has offered to help sponsor this for us. He strategizes with companies to establish training curriculum and delivers executive coaching presentations and workshops. Kenny has 23 years experience as an organizational development consultant and an employee training specialist. He focuses on helping companies manage through the people side of strategic initiatives. So Kenny, welcome. We are so grateful that you're doing this for us.
Thank you very much, Ramona. And I'm going to take just a moment here to share my screen and get a few slides up. So let me go ahead and do that. And I think we are ready to go. You know, Willie and Ramona did a great job setting the stage for why this subject is so important right now, why it's timely. So I'm not going to do more of that. They did it great. I'm going to just go ahead and jump right into it and share with you our brief agenda. We're going to do some simple things today that I hope are impactful and helpful to you. The first thing is I want to talk about common reactions to stress. And let me tell you why we're going to do that. One of the biggest challenges leaders face when employees are going through very stressful times is that sometimes we're caught off guard. We see things, we see people reacting to the stress in ways that maybe surprise us. And when we're caught off guard, that's when we tend to do things that later we might regret as a leader. So I'm going to try to help you understand what you're likely to see in people when they're going through really stressful times, like I think many of us are right now. Then what we're going to do is we're going to talk about holding difficult conversations during these kinds of stressful times. And when I talk about difficult conversations, this is largely about performance conversations. Now, what's different about performance conversations during stressful times is that they can be especially challenging. One of the reasons they're challenging is that you may know that you've got someone who's struggling with their performance, but they're also struggling in their personal life. They're also going through a really hard time, maybe in a relationship or maybe with a parenting challenge as a result of the pandemic. And these performance conversations, when there's the context of all these personal challenges in people's lives, are really hard. And so I want to talk about some strategies that I think help in those situations. The third thing we're going to do is talk about supporting other people through crises, through grief situations. Certainly, that's one of the most stressful situations we can face, is when we encounter the loss of one of our coworkers, or maybe a coworker who lost a loved one and is now back at work. These are difficult interactions. It's not always easy to know as a leader what to say during those kinds of times. And I'm going to give you some guidance and suggestions there. And then finally, you know, sometimes we ignore ourselves as leaders. It's like the flight attendant says on an airline when they're taking off. If the oxygen mask drops from the top, they always tell you put your own mask on first before helping a child or a loved one sitting next to you. And why do they say that? Of course, it's because if you don't put your own mask on first, you're going to pass out you're not going to be any good to that person sitting next to you. Well, the same I think is true of leaders in any organization. Sometimes the best way for you to help other people is to help yourself first. And so I'll conclude today with some self-care reminders that I think are really important. All right, let's jump right into the first one, common reactions to stress. And I want to talk here about 4 categories of reactions that you're likely to see in people when they're going through really stressful times. We'll start at the top left with physical reactions. It is true that people are more likely to experience things like headaches, backaches, shoulder pains during stressful times. Now, the natural follow-up question to that is, okay, I see employees, I see people who work for me going through that kind of symptom, complaining of headaches, backaches, shoulder pains. What do I do? That's the natural follow-up question. What do I do about that? And, my answer to that question probably surprises some people, because my answer is do nothing. Now, I don't really literally mean do nothing, but what I do mean is that it's important that you not do anything all that different from what you would have done if this weren't a particularly stressful time. So you have tools and procedures and policies in place for how to support employees when they have things like headaches, backaches, and shoulder pains. What are those tools and policies and procedures? They're probably things like time off policies that you can support people with. They're probably a empathetic listening ear that you can support people with. And this is really the point of this whole slide. Sometimes what happens is when we start noticing all these situations, headaches, backaches, shoulder pains in the workplace, and instead of doing what we always used to do, be empathetic, explain time off policies where that's appropriate, we start trying to play other roles, giving medical advice and things like that, or letting the employee decide to stay at work when we know they shouldn't stay at work because they're really not feeling well. So the main message here is expect these reactions and then operate essentially the same way you always did. Now, the same is true of the other kinds of reactions. Moving across the right of the screen, you're more likely to see things like emotional outbursts. Those could be angry outbursts. They could be people who are quicker to tears than they are in normal situations. This is something to expect when going through stressful times. Again, the question, what do I do about it? Well, my answer, I'm going to sound like a broken record, is essentially nothing different than what you always used to do about it. Now, if those angry outbursts are affecting the workplace in negative ways and becoming a performance problem, well, you're going to have conversations with people who are having performance problems, including angry outbursts. If those employees need support and help in one way or another, well, you're going to offer them that support and help in ways that you always did. And we'll touch on what those ways might be in just a moment. But I think the again, main message is expect these things. Expect more frequency of angry outbursts, people who are quicker to tears, and don't allow yourself to be overly caught off guard by them. And the same is true as I move through the screen, behavioral reactions. Sometimes people are prone to, even when they might have thought they kicked a habit related to alcohol, drugs, gambling, well, those bad habits often resurface during stressful times, and sometimes you find out about them in the workplace. Again, I reinforce the message, do what you always did about those things. Certainly, if these things are impacting the workplace, you have policies and procedures in place. Now is not the time to start skirting those policies and procedures, acting in some different way because maybe you have an employee who is coming to work with alcohol on his or her breath, as an example. So follow the same policies and procedures that you always did. Don't be caught off guard. And the same is true with cognitive reactions. People are more likely during stressful times to become forgetful. They're more likely to show up late to a meeting because they forgot what time it started, or maybe not show up at all. Trouble concentrating, trouble remembering things. And what you don't want to do is allow yourself, because you know that people are going through stressful times, to treat these situations differently now than you always did. So if you had employees who were late to work before the pandemic, or late to meetings, or blowing meetings off all the time, I suspect you would have conversations with those employees about what's expected and about what support they might need from you to turn that behavior around. Well, my suggestion is Don't stop having those conversations, just like you always did. So expect these common reactions, but then this is a good lead into the next screen. Remember your role in all of this. Because the biggest challenge I think we face as leaders when we know people are struggling with stress in their life is we start playing roles that we shouldn't play. And those roles we shouldn't play are the ones with the X at the bottom of the screen. We know people are struggling, and so we become a therapist for them. We know they're experiencing headaches, backaches, and shoulder pains, like I talked about before. And so we start doling out medical advice instead of managing their performance. We might think or know that they're struggling with personal finances and become a personal financial advisor. Not good roles for a leader in an organization. So what is your role? Well, be empathetic, as I hope you always were before the pandemic, before other major stresses that have hit people in their life. But being empathetic doesn't mean that we stop becoming a manager of performance. In fact, we'll talk more about this later. You actually do people no favors if you start letting performance issues slide for longer than you used to. You start delaying the conversations that you normally would have had about performance problems. That doesn't do the organization any favors. And more importantly, I think, it doesn't do the employee who's struggling any favors either. And we'll talk about why in a few moments. I think maybe the key, the most important thing on this slide is the third check mark. While it's not your role to be a therapist or a financial advisor, I think it absolutely is the role of any leader in an organization to know and be really an expert in the resources and the benefits that are available to people who might need a therapist, who might need a financial advisor. And of course, I'm, as Pamela told you and as Ramona told you, I'm from ComPsych, the company that provides your employee assistance program. Stressful times are times when, more than ever, it's really important for you as a leader to be knowledgeable about the resources that an EAP can provide for people, so that when you're having those kinds of conversations with people, you know where to refer them, you know how to get them the help that they need, and it helps you avoid the temptation of playing one of those roles that you don't want to play at the bottom of the screen. Now, I want to talk here now about one other kind of reaction you're likely to see as people are struggling with stress. And it's a reaction about accountability. This is something we call the accountability ladder, and it's essentially a self-diagnostic tool. It's a way to assess, both for yourself and for other people, when you're struggling with any kind of issue in life or at work, where am I standing on this ladder? What step am I on? And if you're like a lot of people, you may start at the very bottom step, and you will encounter a lot of employees during stressful times who start at this bottom step. The bottom step is where they're blaming others for whatever the situation is. Now, who are the others that they're blaming? I don't know. It could be you, their manager, that they're blaming for the situation. More commonly, I think people blame senior leadership in the organization. They might not name names, but in general, senior leadership is behind these issues, these stresses that I'm facing. Sometimes it's broader than that. It's politicians in society that have put us in this terrible situation. They're to blame for the stress that I'm feeling right now. And so you are very likely to encounter people who are at the bottom of this accountability ladder. Sometimes they start climbing up a little bit. They're not blaming anymore, but they're making excuses, coming up with reasons there's no way they could get through this situation. We climb up a little more, and we're still not doing anything about it. We're just waiting and hoping it gets better. And then you see there's this sort of imaginary blue line, and there's what we call below the line thinking and above the line thinking. Below the line thinking is unfortunately thinking that gives you and the employees who might work for you essentially no chance to come home at the end of the day or finish your workday if you're working from home. And when someone asks you, "How was your day today, Kenny?" If you've spent your day at those bottom three steps, you have no chance to say it was a good day. You are going to say it was a miserable day. Now, when you start climbing, you get above that blue line. That's where, at a minimum, you're acknowledging the reality of the situation, owning it, and then the key being finding solutions. Now, this doesn't mean if you're an employee maybe who doesn't have any direct reports, so somebody who works for you, I don't mean that you have to be finding solutions for the department you're in, for the team you're on, for the organization as a whole. What I mean is that you want to be finding solutions for yourself. You want to be focused on thinking about, what am I going to do about this stressful situation that I'm in right now? And once you find those solutions, you make them happen, and you GOWI, the word at the top here, you get on with it. Now, the reason I share this accountability ladder, this self-diagnostic tool with you, is I think as leaders, it's a really good opportunity for you also to recognize you may have some people who need help climbing this ladder. You may encounter them at the very bottom step, and if they're at the bottom step, they are not going home at the end of the day and saying, I had a good day today. So how do you help them climb up? Well, that's what I'm going to get into on this next screen, how you help them climb this ladder. I think it's by focusing on what we call the question behind the question. And what this means is, you can see kind of from the graphic, that when there are questions rolling around in our minds during stressful times, there's always one behind them that has the focus on the word I. And as a leader, to whatever extent you can get your employees to shift their focus to the question that has the word I in it, you are doing your part to help them climb that ladder. Let me share some examples of this with you. Let's say you have people who are stressed out by what's going on, and there's this just general question rolling around in their mind. Number one, when are things going to improve? Well, the question behind the question there is something like, what am I going to do to help improve things? Doesn't mean what am I going to do to improve things for the organization, for the department, but what am I going to do to help things improve from my own situation? So when you get them to shift their question to that I question, you've done a great part in helping them have a chance to come home at the end of the day and say it was a good day. Number two, why won't management communicate better? One thing I can promise people is I don't know why management won't communicate better, but I do know if you spend your day focused on that question, you're going to have a miserable day. So how can we shift the focus to the question behind the question, which is something like, what can I do to help management communicate better? What questions can I ask management to get the information I think I need? Or here's another really, really important one. What can I do to get my job done, to be happy here, even though I don't like the way management's communicating? If you feel like you can influence management's communication, great, then ask one of those first two questions behind the question. But sometimes in any organization, there are certain things that we just have to accept we're not going to change. And then the question behind the question becomes, what am I going to do to be happy anyway? What am I going to do to get my job done anyway, even though I don't like this one aspect of my job and where I work? And then, I hope nobody out there on our webinar is thinking number three, but if you are, that's okay. I'm tough. I can handle it. But if I imagine someone out there thinking, what's the point of this terrible training? The real problem with that isn't that I'm personally insulted. It's that that person has not picked up on the lessons from the training, which are, be more accountable than that. Instead of asking yourself, what's the point of this terrible training? Ask yourself something like, what can I possibly get out of this training, even though I don't like it, if you don't like it? Or even this one, I hope no one's doing it, but what can I do to distract myself? What games can I play on my phone so I don't have to listen to this guy Kenny talk for 30 minutes? Now, I hope no one's choosing that one, but I promise you, I would rather you're asking that question than wallowing in the misery of what's the point of this terrible training. And that's really the whole point of this message. To whatever extent you as a leader can shift the questions that your employees ask from things like this to questions that have the word I in it, you are really helping them feel better at the end of the day and likely be more productive as well. All right, let's move now to the next part of our agenda, which is about some tangible tips, I hope, for holding difficult conversations. And the first one of those tangible tips is to avoid these three common traps that leaders find themselves in. Now, these things are all traps because we do them with good intentions. We're trying to help, but they actually accomplish the opposite of that helpful intent. Enabling is when we shield people from the consequences of poor work performance. And why do we do this? Well, maybe I've got an employee, his name is Kenny, and Kenny's been doing really sloppy work lately. But I know the reason Kenny's been doing sloppy work is he's going through a very hard time right now. He's got some parenting challenges at home. I know because I've heard through the grapevine that this whole pandemic thing has impacted his marriage, and he's really struggling in his marriage and relationships at home. And so I know this sloppy work is a result of the fact that Kenny's going through all these personal stresses. So I'm going to let it slide. I'm going to shield him from consequences. Why is this a trap? Well, you're actually not helping Kenny. I know that's your intent, but you're not. The reason I know you're not is that what we know about people who are struggling in their personal life is that they likely need help. Kenny would likely benefit from calling the Employee Assistance Program, for example. Well, when do you think Kenny is most likely to seek that help? It's when he knows that his manager, his boss, recognizes it and is still holding him accountable for performance issues. That's when Kenny's most likely to get help with some of these personal challenges. So I don't mean that you should be cold and lack empathy towards what Kenny is going through, but you do him no favors when the way you show that empathy is to let poor work performance slide. The same is true with these next two items, which are similar: denying and withdrawing. Denying is pretending, even though we know it's really happening, that the problem doesn't really exist. And then withdrawing is situations like, well, I know Kenny's been doing really sloppy work lately, but if I just don't review the reports he submits the way I used to, then I don't have to notice and I don't have to have these conversations. So we just withdraw ourselves as a leader so that we don't deal with these challenges. And so what's the antidote? What's the escape route for these traps? Well, it's to be willing to have the difficult conversation with Kenny. And so I want to give you two tangible ways to do it that allow you to remain empathetic, show Kenny that you care, but not let the work performance slide. And one of these tangible ways is to use what we call I messages instead of you messages. That little three-letter word, YOU, it seems innocent enough, but when you use it as the focus of a conversation, especially about a performance issue with someone who is stressed out already, they feel attacked. And when people feel attacked, what do? They want to defend themselves or even attack back, not the recipe for a productive performance conversation. So instead of things like, you don't respond well when people give you feedback, try something like, I'm concerned about the responses I've gotten when I've tried to give you feedback. Instead of, your tone of voice is inappropriate for a professional environment, try something like, I think it's important to maintain a professional tone even when you're upset. Instead of, your negative attitude is affecting the whole team, I'm concerned about the effect that some of your statements are having on other people. So these phrases, I'm concerned, I think, I'm worried, they are a great way to start a conversation about some kind of performance observation you have, as opposed to you this and you that. So that's your first tangible technique that I think is simple, but really, really powerful. And the second one is to keep the focus in these kinds of conversations on facts instead of judgments and evaluations. So I'll illustrate this with examples too. Instead of, you're always late to meetings and it has to stop, try, you were late to our team meeting today, as well as the department meeting last week, and I'd like to talk to you about what's going on. Instead of, sometimes you come across as rude when you're talking to people, try something like, I heard you say, not now, I'm busy, and then you hung up when Lisa called you yesterday. I'd like to have a conversation with you about what might be some better ways of handling that kind of situation. Instead of, your lack of attention to detail has been unacceptable, something like, 4 people have called to complain that you sent them the wrong information. Here, I printed out what they received. I'd like to show it to you, and let's talk about what happened here and what support you might need from me to clean some of this stuff up. So I messages, facts instead of judgments. Do these things make the conversations easy? No, they don't. These are always going to be hard conversations, especially when you know the employee is going through some personal life stresses. but they give you a chance to have the conversation be difficult, but respectful, and maybe even productive, maybe even open a dialogue that improves performance and also gives you an opportunity to point out things like EAP resources that can help Kenny or whoever it might be with whatever he or she is struggling with. All right, let's move to the next part of our agenda now, which is admittedly really difficult part of the agenda, but it's one that I think a lot of managers struggle with. A lot of human beings struggle with it. What do I say? What do I do when there's been some kind of crisis, especially a death in the workplace or even the death of a loved one of one of our employees? How do we support people? What do we say as leaders when things like that happen? And I want to start with the concept of overcoming fear and avoidance, because this is really the most important thing. Our instinctive reaction is really powerful. And our instinctive reaction in these situations is almost always to minimize our own contact with people who are suffering. It's a natural fight or flight reaction, and the flight usually wins when we are encountering people who are really suffering. We want to minimize our contact, and we justify that by saying things to ourselves like, I'm not a therapist, how can I know what to say? Maybe I'm going to say something that makes them feel worse. And so I want to start by making the point that there are no perfect words. You are very unlikely to make someone who's suffering with grief feel worse because of the words you use. Your words are not that powerful in that moment. The grief they're feeling is very powerful. Your words are supportive at best. And so to me, the way to intervene in your own fear, your own hesitation, is to recognize, I'm not here to fix the problem. I'm not even necessarily here to make them feel better right now, but I'm here to let them know I care. And by letting them know you care, that in itself is a help. And so that's where this starts. And then I think, whatever words you use, you are going to be met with some of these reactions. When you either break the news to somebody that there's been a death in the workplace, or you talk to someone who you know has suffered a loss, sometimes you'll be met with shock. And what do if you're met with shock? Well, my suggestion is be willing to sit in silence. If someone reacts in shock and they are silent themselves, you don't have to fill in the gap with your own words. You might encounter severe emotional pain. If you do, I think it's really important to remind yourself your role is not to take the pain away. Your role is to empathize, validate the pain, let the person know that what they're feeling is normal and that you care about what they're feeling, but you don't have to try to fix it. You may encounter someone who expresses helplessness. There's no way I can get through this day. There's no way I can get through this year with what's just happened. When you encounter helplessness, I think it starts with listening, but then a really key technique is to act to help. Don't just ask about helping. And I want to give you a concrete example of what I mean by this. It's not a big thing. It's small things that you do to act to help, because when people are helpless, asking them if they'd like help is actually more of a burden for them. It actually makes the situation even harder for them, because now they have one more thing they have to do, which is respond to your question about whether they need help. So let me give you a concrete, tangible way to do this. Let's say you see someone struggling and you think they might benefit from calling the EAP. Instead of asking them, would you like me to get you the number for the EAP to call? Simple way of changing that is to go and get the number yourself, write it down on a little piece of paper, and instead of saying, would you like the number, say, hey, I just want to let you know I wrote down the number for the EAP for you. I'm going to leave it here with you. That small gesture, that small act to help, rather than just asking a question about help, makes a huge difference to somebody who's struggling with grief or some other crisis in their life. You may encounter verbalizations that seem nonsensical. That's okay. Just listen without interrupting. And you may even encounter someone who blames you. This is your fault that this happened. There's this misattribution, this mistrust and blame in the wrong place is very common when people are going through grief and crisis. All I would say to that is, You can't fix it, but if you do promise to do something, make sure you follow through on those promises during especially stressful times. All right. I also, before I wrap up this section and then just wrap up before we move to our Q&A, want to just share some common things people say with good intent in these situations, but don't actually have the most positive outcomes. These are some responses to avoid when someone's struggling with grief or a loss. Attempts to be profound, saying things like, everything happens for a reason. Sometimes people bring religion into these kinds of statements. And unless it's somebody who you know is going to respond well to that, it's not the time to bring profound religious statements in to these situations. Minimizing, this too shall pass, or I went through what you're going through too. These are attempts to empathize, and so they're said with positive intent. The problem is when you say something like, I went through what you're going through, to somebody who in that moment feels like their pain, their suffering is the worst possible pain and suffering imaginable, well, that sounds like minimizing. That sounds like you just don't get it. Nobody gets it. And so those good intents actually accomplish the opposite of their results. And then when someone's really struggling, telling them what they should do, giving them commands, it doesn't work. This is another a good place for I statements instead of you statements. So instead of something like, you should really get out there and take a walk, try something like, I have found in my own situations when I've really been struggling that getting up and taking a walk has really helped me. You should statements, commands, they come across really poorly when someone is suffering with grief. All right, last part of our agenda before I wrap up and we move to our Q&A. I do want to remind you about that flight attendant who gives that speech about safety. Sometimes the most important way to take care of the organization and your employees is to take care of yourself first. Practice deep breathing techniques. Practice mindfulness visualization techniques. I can answer any questions about those that you might have through our Q&A. Make sure that you take time to find enjoyment in life yourself. Now is not the time to let your important hobbies go by the wayside. Maybe it's the time to pick up new ones if you need to. And it's also a good time to practice gratitude. Some people do that by keeping a formal gratitude journal. I think that's great, writing down every day what you're grateful for. Sometimes it's just stopping in the moment and appreciating what's right there in front of you. As I wrap up, I'll put our agenda slide up again. These are the 4 things that we talked about. I just put them up as a reminder as we move into our Q&A section of the agenda. I'm here to participate in any questions that you might have about any of the things we talked about. I hope you picked up some useful information, and I'll turn it over now and stop sharing my screen as we get ready for Q&A.
All right, Kenny, thank you so much. That was so informative and some great words of advice for everyone. And I know this is really difficult. I do have a question that someone has submitted. What recommendations do you have for staffers to connect with one another, especially during this work from home time?
Yeah, that's such a great question. I can talk about a couple of concrete ways for people to connect with one another, but I want to start with just an overall mindset that I think is really important when you're in a remote environment like many of us are in now. And that is that there's sort of an inverse relationship between how proactive you have to be about connecting with other people and how much time you spend at home isolated from other people. And so the message there is the more isolated you are at home, the more time you're spending at home, the more proactive you have to be in connecting with other people. And so how do you do that? There are all sorts of technologies, but that's less important, whether you use some sort of instant messaging, give people a call, send them emails. I think more important than that is establishing the mindset. It's up to me to be proactive. And, to turn that into something tangible, what I have to do is say to myself, I'm going to make Fridays from 4 to 5 my time to go and connect with people, because if I don't, I'm not going to do that proactive thing that I said is so important. So great question. I'm glad you brought that one up.
Thanks, Kenny.
Yeah, Kenny, very helpful information. Thank you. I want to take you up on your offer to offer some techniques, particularly in cases where you have somebody that's very upset, and you mentioned that scenario where they're blaming you for the situation, and they're very angry and they're very upset, and the tendency is to react and to defend. So what are some techniques to help us not go there, not react, not get defensive? What can we do to kind of keep our composure when we're dealing with somebody who's in that mental state?
Yeah, great point. And I think, part of the point you bring up there, Ramona, is that when you're dealing with somebody who's in that mental state, often you yourself become in that mental state too, right? And so for me, this starts with recognizing that what's happening both in yourself and in that other person is a chemical reaction. And I think, thinking of it in sort of neurobiological terms like this, you don't have to be a neurobiologist, but thinking about it in these terms is really helpful. When someone is yelling and screaming and in my face, calling me names, and I have the temptation to do that back at them, what's happening to that other person is they are having a chemical reaction in their brain. In fact, if you were to look at the brain image of that person in that very agitated state, you would see different neurotransmitter activity in that brain versus that same person in a calm state. And the same is true in your own brain. Now, let me be clear about this. Sometimes people mistake this. What I'm suggesting here is not a communication tool. I'm not suggesting that you say back to that person, I know why you're yelling at me. It's because you're having a chemical reaction right now, aren't you? No. That's not going to be helpful. But that reminder for yourself that that's what's going on. This is neurochemistry happening. I think it really, really helps us adopt a better perspective, put ourselves back in more control so that we can respond in a way that we don't later regret. So I hope that's a helpful way of thinking about it.
That's very helpful. Where were you when my daughters were teenagers? I could have really used that advice back then.
Mine are about to be there, so I probably need it myself.
I will say bless both of you, because anyone who's had to raise children probably feels this, can understand this conversation. Kenny, we have another question for you. How do we help guide employees to resources as a suggestion/resource rather than making them feel it is a requirement?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really good question. Part of what I'm going to do in answering it is go back to one of the messages I talked about earlier, which is that the time that it is most likely that people will reach out for help through the EAP or any other resources is when they realize there are consequences of not doing so. So that does not mean that you have to make it mandatory that they reach out for help. But it does mean that you don't stop holding them accountable the same way you always did for performance issues. So if somebody's doing sloppy work, you make an empathetic referral to the employee assistance program. You make sure they know that you care, but it is not the time to stop following up on that sloppy work and making sure the sloppy work isn't getting better, isn't improving, because that follow-up on the sloppy work is what's actually going to make it most likely that they reach out for help without you making it mandatory that they reach out for help. So I hope, it's not new information, but I think reinforcing that message from earlier is probably the best response that I've got to that one.
Thank you for that. I wanted to go back to your questions behind the question. I think that's what that slide you referred to. Yeah. And you talked about getting the employee to think, or the individual to think about it in I statements. Could it be that we're trying to, because I think when people are feeling stressed, part of it is a lack of control. They feel like things are being done unto them, that they have no control over the situation. In HR, we like to make sure that the employee feels like they're back into control, giving them some accountability for their actions. So is that the purpose behind the I statements, is to get the employees to feel, or the individuals to give them a sense of control, or give them an ability to control what they can and not stress over the things they can't manage?
No, I think that's exactly right. And what they can always control, although they don't see it, you and I don't see it either all the time. When we're as guilty as anybody else of being at the bottom of the accountability ladder sometimes. What we're always in control of, though, is our reaction to the situation. We always have control of that. And I think you hit the nail on the head. It's about reminding people that they have control of that. Now, one thing I probably didn't emphasize enough when we talked about the question behind the question is that this starts with showing empathy, though. you won't get people to see their question behind the question if you don't empathize with the pain and the frustration and the difficulty that they're experiencing. So when someone says, why won't management communicate better around here? And they're really mad about it, the best response is to start by saying, you know what, it is really frustrating when we feel like we're not getting the information we need from management. I've been there too. I've been frustrated by that. So I think it starts there, and then asking a question that might redirect them, like, you know, what do you think we can do, you know, to get the information that we need, to get the answers that you think we need. But starting with empathy, I think that is really critical.
Yeah, thank you for that, Kenny. Empathy is so important, so important. Here's another question for you. Sometimes under stress, small problems look large to individuals. What is a good technique for helping people gain perspective?
Yeah, you know, first of all, I'd say you're exactly right. Not to bring everything back to brain chemistry, but what you're describing is a biological function that happens in the brain. When we're under stress, we distort the world around us, and the most common distortion is to exaggerate how bad and how awful, especially other people are, or our own situation might be. So it is a phenomenon. So part of it starts there with, you know, like the other situation, recognizing that this is brain chemistry at work, and sometimes just a little time, if you let it pass, will help you gain a different perspective, and not make the thing seem as big as it is today. So a little time, not acting too quickly when you don't have to, is I think the order of the day in those kinds of situations.
Thank you. I would love your advice on a situation where an employee who's going through stress and has decided to exhibit some of these feelings about the organization, unhappiness, whatever, but then brings a party along, tries to get people within their unit or other coworkers to kind of join their party. How do you, and now it becomes a big morale thing for your entire unit, for your entire team. How do you get to that? How do you work with a team that has now been brought into this unhappy environment?
Yeah, I mean, you know, that's such a important question. And to some extent, I think my answer is going to be, you probably don't want to overly make it about the team, because as much as it seems that this one person may have brought the team along to their negativity and their way of thinking, everyone is an individual. Everyone's got their own mindset and approach to these situations. So I think having one-on-one conversations about attitude and morale is likely to be more effective than painting with a broad brush in department meetings and things like that. So I caution people against, you know, painting with too broad a brush, addressing morale issues too much in big department meetings, and instead I think you're more effective when you do it one-on-one.
Thank you. Appreciate that.
Thanks, Kenny. You know, we have, I think, time for one more question, and here's a question, and it's hopefully you will have some suggestions to help employees who are in distress when we as leaders are also in distress. So how do we do that? I mean, for a lot of us, we're experiencing some anxiety and other things as well. So any suggestions to help us as leaders help other people who are also in distress?
I do, and I think I'm going to make sure I don't talk too long because we're wrapping up, but I have a lot of suggestions. I think the main one, though, is don't hide your distress. It is so powerful to let people see their leaders also struggling. So talk about your struggles. I don't mean you have to get into deep issues in your personal life, but if you're struggling, talk openly about the fact that you're struggling. Make it okay to struggle. That mere act of letting other people see that it's okay to struggle, even for the most senior leaders in our organization, I think goes a long way to helping them overcome their own challenges. So don't try to hide it. In fact, bring people along into your own struggles to whatever extent you're comfortable with.
Thanks, Kenny. So you're telling us to be a little bit more transparent with the things that we are struggling with as well.
I think it helps.
I think that's great advice. Thank you.
Thanks, Kenny.
Thank you, Kenny.
All right. Well, thank you so much, Kenny. We learned a lot today and got to a bunch of questions. And a big thanks also to Willie and Ramona for co-hosting. This has been great to understand a little bit more about how the organization works and also give some helpful hints on handling stress. So just as a reminder, we have 3 more of these sessions coming up. Hopefully you'll join us every Tuesday at 11. Next week, we have Kirsten Quamback co-hosting another stress management technique topic. And then Dr. Banks is coming back for how to create resilience in the workplace. And then finally, we'll have Brian Hervey and Peter Schneider co-hosting a financial planning webinar. So feel free to mark your calendar for these. Also, we will post both the presentation and the recording on the website that was in the chat box a few different times. And there we go. Yeah, it's in there now. Thank you, Diane Hall, so much for doing that. So with that, I'll say thank you for joining us. Have a great afternoon, everybody. Manage that stress. Take care.